populations. Small populations remain, they repopulate, then comes on another wave of infection, and so on and so forth. Okay. And this is at the time of the AIDS pandemic, which still hasn't quite ended yet, although thanks to all the drugs that are available, it can at least be under control. But you can see what happens when you have a large pandemic of that nature. There's a lot of social unrest, okay? And this is the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and the mall right there. And every year, there would be the AIDS quilt that would be put out. And every piece of fabric there represented an individual who had died of AIDS. Eventually, the quilt became so big that it could no longer be held on the mall at all. You go 40 years later, this is at the time of inauguration of Joe Biden, and the same mall in Washington, D.C., and this time they put 440,000 flags representing each individual who had died of COVID, okay? And today we think that there are over 1 million people have died in the United States alone. And at the peak of the infection, there were 400 people were dying a day. And even now, there are close to 300 to 500 people are dying every single day. Okay. So the pandemic is really far from over. If you look at coronaviruses, all human coronaviruses cause neurological complications, okay? They have slightly different receptors, but they all affect the nervous system. Now, if you trace the variants of SARS-CoV-2, you find that over a period of time, from alpha to delta, they became more transmissible, but the neurological complications were very similar. Didn't really change. With Omicron, we know that it's become more infectious. We're not 100% sure if it's less virulent or not, but it appears that way, at least in the populations here, but in part that may be because the population is vaccinated or has been previously infected. And then there is a new variant that was just recently published from Taiwan, where they claimed it was causing encephalitis in children in greater proportions than they'd seen with any of the others. So the virus can go in either direction, can become more transmissible, less virulent, or even more virulent. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the neurological complications. And during the acute phase, you can get variety of different types of neurological complications. Certainly, if the lungs are affected or kidneys are affected, you can get metabolic or hypoxic encephalopathy. There's loss of smell. A lot of patients do develop strokes, and it causes a coagulopathy. And there's some patients who die suddenly, and it's called Ondine's curse. So they'll find that they usually die in their sleep. Okay, and I'll show you why we think that might be the case. Then there's a subgroup of patients who develop these subacute inflammatory syndromes, and they can affect the brain and the spinal cord, and in children, it can cause a multi-system inflammatory syndrome. Okay. But most of the time, I'm going to spend on long COVID over here. So it became apparent that a number of patients who would develop COVID, that they were not getting better. And so this is from a study in the UK. There's a large population there. And so they traced these individuals who had one or more symptoms. And over a period of time, they noticed that by about 3 months or so, a lot of patients were getting better, but then there's some remained who never got better. The other thing they noticed was that it was more often in women compared to men, and more often in the age group of 30 to 40 years of age. So that just by the epidemiology itself suggested the possibility that this was an immune-mediated phenomenon. But if you start splitting these so-called long COVID patients, what you realize is that there are really two groups. One is those individuals who are admitted in the hospital or the ICU, and they come out, and it takes them a while to get better. Some may not improve completely. And that is understandable because they have very severe disease affecting multiple organs. But then this is this other smaller group of individuals who had relatively mild symptoms. They never went to the hospital. They may even recover nearly completely. And then after a few days or weeks, they develop new symptoms. And these symptoms then don't go away. And I think this is the population that is of main concern. But unfortunately, the use of the term long COVID has been applied equally to both populations. So I like to separate the first group as calling them post-intensive care syndrome or post-hospital syndrome. And then you have these others, and they are also not just one single syndrome. We've divided them into 4 different buckets. There's certainly overlap, but I think it's important to split them because the pathophysiology is quite different, and hence the treatment will be quite different. So there's some individuals who complain predominantly of exercise intolerance. So they could go up a flight of stairs and they get totally wiped out for the rest of the day. There are others who have difficulty with cognition, sleep, or for the first time in their life, they can get pretty severely depressed or develop psychosis. Okay. There are other individuals who get a variety of pain syndromes. And then there are others who develop autonomic symptoms. So they can stand up and get really dizzy. In fact, there was one neurologist I talked to, and after she developed COVID, she was talking to me on the phone, and she says that I have to lie down to talk to you. I can't even sit up in my bed to talk. She would get dizzy every time. Now, these symptoms are not necessarily unique to COVID. There are other kinds of syndromes that we've known for a while, and they've remained a mystery. Nobody really understands what's going on with these patients. For one is chronic fatigue syndrome. The other is post-Lyme disease. Then you have Gulf War illness, fibromyalgia, sick building syndrome. The symptoms are quite similar. But most people go to physicians and they run all kinds of tests. They don't know what's wrong with them. And so people then disbelieve their symptoms. And so it's been a real dilemma as to how to really manage these patients and study them. So one hope is that as we study long COVID, all the other illnesses will also benefit from the knowledge gained here. The numbers that I state here are the estimated numbers of individuals that we think are affected within the United States alone. Okay. So worldwide, the numbers would be extremely staggering. This is a small cohort that we brought to NIH, and our population is a little bit biased because we are neurologists, but 100% of these patients with long COVID had cognitive problems and fatigue, and then lesser number of individuals had all these other kinds of symptoms. Okay, something went wrong with this slide here. Let's just look at the bottom one. So people have done PET scans on these individuals and shown that there are focal areas within the brain, especially on the base of the brain, that seem to be more affected in these patients. Okay. Now, this is an interesting study from the UK, where what they did was they, before the pandemic, they had a population that they had been following with repeated MRI scans and some cognitive testing. And so the idea was to follow healthy individuals and see how things evolve over a period of time. Now, when COVID hit, of course, that population, some of them got infected with the disease. So they ultimately chose about 400 individuals who had COVID and 384 that were controls that did not have COVID. And this is from the pre-vaccination times. So they then compared their total intracranial volume. And what they found was if you stratify them by age, the older the individuals, the greater the difference in brain volume. Okay. And they also looked at cognitive testing. And so here they found that the older the individuals, the worse they did on cognitive testing if they were infected with COVID. Okay. So the bottom line is that no matter what you do, just don't get old. Okay, so now the question is, how do people really get infected? Okay, is it possible that there's a persistent viral infection, or is it possible that there's immune dysregulation, or the two? maybe interacting with one another. What really is the pathophysiology of long COVID is the mystery. So initially we thought it'll be pretty simple. You have a viral infection, it's present in the nose. You have the cribriform plate over here, which has very close connection to the brain, and there are all kinds of blood vessels and neurons passing through. So it shouldn't take much for the virus to get here. But to our surprise, actually, it wasn't all that easy. Okay. In fact, when people started looking for virus in the brain, you could hardly ever find it, even there was lots of virus in the nasal mucosa. So we looked at the brain at autopsy, and what we found was that the biggest pathology really was here in these perivascular region of these blood vessels. And we found a lot of fibrinogen over here. And these fibrinogen should actually be inside the blood vessel, not outside. And there was leakage of fibrinogen, suggesting that there's compromise of the blood-brain barrier and leading to leakage of all these proteins over here. Okay. Again, in the so here we did high resolution scanning of the optic bulb, the olfactory bulb, and again we found the same thing here. Something went wrong with my slides here, but nonetheless, yes, there is infection in the olfactory mucosa, but not in the bulb. Okay, so the bulb has a lot of leakage of fibrinogen, but we never found any virus here. We did a lot of different ways of looking for the virus. And what we found was that there was even others that have looked for the virus, they can very rarely find virus and in very small quantities. And we used a lot of different techniques and really couldn't find any virus by multiple different techniques within the brain. Now, there's one paper that was just recently published in Nature by some of my colleagues here at NIH. And they claimed that they could find evidence of virus in multiple organ systems. But really, if you look at it, especially in the brain, you will see that the amount that they detected, for example, in the lungs, less than 14 days post-infection, you can see about 9,000 copies, okay, per nanogram of RNA. In the brain, even at less than 14 days, there are only 32 copies, and greater than a month, they found 0.39. So there's hardly any virus really that can be detected in the brain, and they never found any pathology associated with it in the brain either. So I think just the presence of a little bit of virus cannot explain the syndrome that these patients develop. Okay. So so let me just go. So the next question really is that is there possibility that it is an immune-mediated phenomenon? And what I'm going to show you is that most of it is likely mediated via antibodies or by macrophages. Okay. Okay, so if you look at these blood vessels here, you will find that number of these blood vessels have activated platelets here. All these brown cells are platelets, and we found a lot of platelets aggregated around the blood vessels. Okay. And when we looked at the brainstem here, we found that there were neurons that were atrophic and there are microglia around them. And that suggests that there's neuronophagia taking place in the brain here. Okay. And we did high resolution MRI scans over here of the brainstem, and then identified areas where we found there was a lot of microglial cell activation. And so it suggests to us that there are two phenomena taking place. One was within the blood vessels, and the second phenomenon that was taking place was all within the brainstem, leading to neuronal damage. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, and that's strange. Let me just see if I do that. Will it change it? No, I won't. That is bizarre. Okay. All right. Anyways, forget what's written on top, but really what I want to emphasize is that people have now looked at blood and spinal fluid to see what other kinds of markers you can find. And in some of these COVID patients, you can find that there's increased amount of phospho-tau as well, okay? And so that is of concern because it suggests that over a period of time, you can get increase in levels of a protein aggregation that can take place, and it may predispose individuals of developing protein aggregation diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. Another interesting study that came out of the Netherlands was looking at microglial cell activation in the brain. Now, it's a small sample size of only 2 individuals, but what they did was they did a PET scan with a ligand that binds to activated microglia. And so at the bottom is a healthy control, it's all blue. And here you can see an increased uptake over here. So that's how the scale works. These brighter colors mean increased uptake. So you can see there's just excessive amounts of microglial cell activation within the brain. So the inflammation really is a key part of what is happening in these individuals. And I showed you that. We also looked at the cerebellum over here, and you can see that in the cerebellum, on the left side, you have these normal looking cerebellum. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's loss of neurons here. So this is a neuronal marker for neurofilament, and you can see that there's just loss of neurons in a patchy manner all throughout the cerebellum. And if you look at the Purkinje cells themselves, they're also lost over here. Okay, so, okay, I showed you previously about phospho-tau. Actually, here's a better slide. I don't know how it got incorporated in that previous one, but anyways, here you can see the phospho-tau was increased. And also you can see that A beta is decreased, and a decrease of A beta means that it's actually aggregated within the brain itself. So most often in Alzheimer's patients, you will see a decrease in A beta. And people have also reported increase in neurofilament. So it suggests that there's ongoing neural injury taking place, and there's protein aggregation taking place in the brains of patients with long COVID. Okay. Now, this is a macaque model, and in this macaque model, they showed that there's also aggregation of synuclein in these macaques infected with COVID, and the COVID is in the lungs, not in the brain, but again, showing that all these types of proteins can aggregate within the brain. Okay, so what we think is happening is that most of the pathology occurs at the blood vessel. And so you can see that we think the antibodies attached to the blood vessel, there's rupture of the adhesion molecules, cells and protein then come in. There are then macrophages that come in to kind of clean up the mess. You get some microhemorrhages here. The microglial cells then get activated, and then they will attack the neurons and cause a neuronal injury. So how do we treat patients? Now, this is a paper that was just published this month in Nature Microbiology, and they listed a whole slew of potential treatments that can be used for treating patients with long COVID. What I like to caution you is that none of this is evidence-based. Okay, so it's all theoretical, and there's no evidence that any of this actually works. They say that some of this is from the chronic fatigue literature, but none of them have actually been done in clinical trials in chronic fatigue either. So they may make somewhat theoretical sense, but one has to be a little bit careful in using them. I would suggest that if one is going to use them, one should probably do it in the context of a clinical trial. Okay. So we think that a lot of this is immune mediated. And so if there is certainly persistent virus in long COVID patients, then the use of antivirals makes sense. But again, I would advocate that this should be done in the context of clinical trials. I showed you that there's activation of innate immune responses, and hence there are several potential candidates that can be used to dampen the innate immune responses. There is immune exhaustion in these patients, so one can use checkpoint inhibitors. There is a subgroup of patients in which there are autoantibodies that people have reported. And so for that subgroup, one can use anti-B cell therapies, okay? And then certainly one can use corticosteroids, but that's not a long-term solution. It will tell you that at least it's an immune-mediated phenomenon, and you can use it for short periods of time, but long-term corticosteroids can have profound side effects. The challenges in doing these clinical trials is that most of the endpoints are very subjective. Patients have a lot of complaints, but it's very hard to get objective parameters. And the natural history of the disease is also unknown. Some patients will get better. Some of them will get better even a year after onset of symptoms. So I'd like to conclude by saying that direct invasion of the brain by SARS-CoV-2 is rare and does not explain the neurological complications. Neuroimmune dysfunction is driven by activation of innate immunity, immune exhaustion, and antibody-mediated phenomenon. And clinical trials with immunotherapies could be considered in patients with long COVID and may be relevant to other post-infection syndromes. So I'd like to acknowledge a few people. So all the pathology was done in my lab by Minghua. The viral detection was done by Wenshu, and Dragon did some of the immunohistochemistry as well. And these are the neuropathologists who contributed some of the tissues to us and helped with interpretation of the findings. Serena Spudik and I wrote the paper in Science on the pathophysiology of long COVID. And now we have the clinical studies ongoing, and this is our clinical team over here. And this is our MRI team that did the postmortem MRI scans. And Walter is the institute director who provided us all the support for these studies. So I'll stop here and take questions. Try to make up some time for you.